approval of the minutes from the September 2018 meeting. I'll entertain a motion to approve. Have a second? It's been moved and properly second to approve the minutes without objection. Okay, the minutes have been approved. Item 11 is the Corporate Governance Engagement Plan. Aisha, and this is an action item. Welcome, Aisha. Good afternoon.
Aisha Stagny, Portfolio Manager, Corporate Governance. I just have a couple opening comments on the engagement plan, and then I can entertain any questions. First off, I just want to recognize that we know that the firearms is still our #1 and top priority for the corporate governance unit. That being said, the engagement plan is to inform the board about all the other activities that the corporate governance group is currently undertaking. Obviously, we're looking for guidance from the committee and input on our various activities, but I think the engagement plan lays out those activities where we feel are fundamental to protecting the CalSTRS portfolio, but also those activities where we feel we can be most effective in terms of staff engagement. And last but not least, I'm assured that all of you read through the plan, and I just wanted to note all the activities that we're undertaking with different market players. So for example, with our diversity agenda, we're working locally with other California institutional investors. We're also part of the Coalition of Six, which involves global players in the marketplace. If you look at the Climate Action 100, that is a group that we're a part of that actually encompasses 300 different investors from around the globe. And so we're really trying to leverage our resources to be most effective in all these areas.
Thank you. Aisha and staff is looking for some feedback or some guidance on. Joy?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Aisha, and thank you very much for the report and for all the work that you and the team do every year to make us such a leader in this area. I know that we've previously had some discussions about our board diversity initiative. I think prompted in part by some questions by the treasurer about board diversity and whether there are more assertive actions that we could take. And I know that in your report, we talk about engagement that we have had so far with companies where there are not women serving on the board, and a plan to potentially withhold or vote against members of the nominating committee or potentially the full board if we don't think that they've taken sufficient action to address that. Is that sort of a black and white, that if you've met with them and they have not addressed the concern, we will take that action? Or there are often shades of gray in here.
There are definitely shades of gray. I would tell you there are a few companies, not that many, but a few that are completely unresponsive to our letters. And in those cases, we do take definitive action and vote against. In a lot of those cases, it's the whole board. There are those companies where there hasn't necessarily been a woman appointed or a person of color, but we're working with them and they recognize the need for diversity on their board, and it just, because of timing or their search process, it's taking longer than we would like. And so in those cases, they may get a pass for 1 year, but obviously if we're not seeing progress, that's when we would start voting against the NomGov committee.
Got it. May I ask a follow-up?
Sure, of course.
Are you also seeing companies more open to some of the suggestions that we're making around board diversity? So as an example, and we talked about this at the offsite, looking for board members that potentially go outside the conventional auditing, accounting, and finance functions, but looking at people who are leaders from government, the nonprofit sector, in order to enlarge their pipeline of people they're looking at?
Absolutely, and that's where I think the board was there at the offsite, looking at other sources like what the Equilar is providing through their director database. Other sources like academia is always a very good source for potential directors, and that's what we're talking to companies about. And then also on the other side of that is more disclosure or self-identification in terms of diversity, because that's where we're lacking as far as the data is concerned. And we've been focused on women, but that's also just because that's where the data is available. But in our conversations, and that's where we find to be most effective too, because we can understand the challenges that the companies are facing, but also present other ideas for them and other search pools that they can look at.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Can I take all these?
Lynn?
Thank you, Harry. Thank you for the plan. It's another jam-packed plan, another robust year. I appreciate all the efforts of the corporate governance team. I had two questions. One, I was curious if the target companies from Climate Action 100 are the same as the TCFD target companies that CalSTRS is engaging with?
Well, I don't know, Brian, do you want to? Brian's the lead on that, on those two. I'm sure there's some overlap, just like with our diversity initiatives.
Welcome, Brian. Nice to see you.
Brian Rice, Portfolio Manager, Corporate Governance. Actually, I don't think there really is too much overlap because the companies that we're focusing on around the Climate Action 100, there's really 6. So we're actually looking at unique companies to be talking to regarding the TCFD guidance and corporate alignment with that effort.
Okay, great. And what sectors are they in, those companies?
It's kind of a sector, I mean, obviously they're the carbon intensive sectors, transportation, manufacturing, fossil fuels, utilities, those sorts of sectors. But we're also trying to sort of be a bit sector agnostic in the sense trying to get all companies to be looking at climate change and mitigating risks and integrating that in their disclosures and their management plans.
Okay, great, thank you. And my other question was about the work you're doing with the Human Capital Management Coalition, looking at workforce management. And can you describe a little bit about what the emphasis on that is? Is it worker rights violations, or is it retraining employees to add value to the company?
I think it's all encompassing, and that sort of leads into the next agenda item, which is, the addition of the principle about human capital management. This is a work in progress, so we're trying to understand, all companies tell us that their workforce is their most valuable asset, and we've spent so much time on measuring financial aspects of companies, and we don't have a lot of metrics on the value add metrics in terms of human capital. And so I think it's going to be different from company to company, but we're sort of in this learning process talking to companies about what are they doing in terms of training? What are the worker safety issues? We know that a value add is, you don't want a lot of turnover at your company. So how are you retaining your workforce? How are you making sure that the management and the employees are engaged? And then also, what are you doing in terms of your pipeline? Because we talk about board diversity at the top, we want to make sure that they're looking at the pipeline of companies coming up through their organization. So I would say there's more to come on that piece. We're sort of in a learning process, talking to a lot of companies about this, and what we need to be from an investor perspective, what should be disclosed.
Okay, great, thank you.
Chris, and then after Chris, Paul. Chris?
I just wanted to add to Aisha's list, this is a really important item to me that you guys take a focus on. So what we're giving you is, in essence, we numbered 3 in here, but it's our top 4 items that we think are important for the staff to focus on. But we're your resource. The corporate governance team and I put together a list of 35 different issues you've raised in the last year and commented on. You've got basically 15 people in corporate governance. I need you to focus on what's the priority? What is it you want us to hit? I know all of these are important, and many of these you have raised at numerous times, and we make judgment calls about what's a direct, specific spot issue versus a big thing like climate change. I'm going to come back to you probably with at least an email to get you thinking by February of, at least what would be the top 10 out of this 35, because my concern is I can have all 15 people focus on all 35, but I can also sadly guarantee we probably won't get any one of them accomplished. You've got to think of us as a resource, and how do you want to focus that resource and allocate the people? And I know Kirsty Jenkinson, who we met with, who's coming in February, that was one of the key questions we asked the directors is, here's a laundry list of issues that are important. How do you focus on what's critical?
So Chris, Thanks for that. In terms of prioritizing and really emphasizing that and giving some direction, is there, could we just have this as information today and then in February come back with a more focused direction from the committee? Is there anything that would slow your teams down, Aisha, Chris,
I
Brian?
was just going to add, we need you to nod your head because February is still a long way away and proxy season is starting. So if this is generally the direction you want us to go, let us know. If there's other things that you're like, hey, we want that a higher priority. But yes, we can actually do the prioritization of mapping it out. But that's why we bring this to you in November. For us, it's technically the beginning of the proxy year.
And just to add to what Chris is saying, because a lot of what we do right now behind the scenes is engaging companies to help affect what goes into their proxy disclosures. And so most companies print or go through the process of finalizing their proxy statements towards the end of the year, the beginning of the year.
I'm going to act appropriately, and I'll make my comments after everybody else speaks. So just.
You want to say it?
No, I'm going to wait. I'm thinking out loud. Go ahead. No, Paul, you're next. You're next.
We gotta give you a hard time.
No, I got it. Go ahead.
Well,
Oh, gosh.
so we're back on the.
Just
on the
ring in,
topic of the-
Right.
ring back in there, Paul.
Bring us home.
Governance principles, we'll talk about that next. I was just wondering, on the engagement plan, how you make a decision on executive compensation, how voting the proxies on executive compensation. Because my sense is that there are a lot of pension funds that are voting no on executive compensation a lot more than we are. And can you explain how we approach it and why we might vote in favor of comp plans more commonly?
Sure. So, Paul, I think there are a couple plans out there that are sort of outliers and vote against a lot more, say, on pay plans than we do here at CalSTRS. Generally, we float around voting against about 20% of compensation plans. And there's a whole lot of analysis that goes into why we vote against a plan. But primarily, we want to focus on those plans that are the most egregious. So those plans that have the most, that don't have an alignment of pay for performance or have structural issues that we fundamentally think could put the plan at risk. Things like not having, robust clawback policies, using the same metrics in your short and long-term plans. I mean, there's a whole laundry list of things that we look at from a structural standpoint. And then most importantly, looking for that pay for performance alignment. And in that 20% range, I wish I could say we've spent more time engaging companies on that. But as you can see, there's a whole lot of issues in here. And if I vote against 50%, 60% of the plans out there, I can't possibly engage that many companies because the say on pay vote is a very blunt instrument. It doesn't give a lot of clarity into why or what we think they can do to improve. And the goal always is, if we vote against a plan, is to hopefully go back and have a discussion with that company about the nuances and things and areas where they think they should be improving.
So it really does, then, to some degree, come back to then the next agenda item, which is where should our focus be?
Yes.
And you're saying it's a lot of work to engage a lot of companies on pay, and you've decided that the focus will be elsewhere, which.
Well, I think pay is one of those things where it goes straight to the bottom line. I mean, this is money out of the shareholders' coffers. And so I think making sure that there's an alignment there is very important, which is why it's still part of our engagement plan. And so I don't want us to lose sight of that. I think it's just a fundamentally, how do you want to exercise that vote, and how many companies can you effectively engage on compensation? We vote at the Russell 3000. I mean, I think right now we're voting against around 20% of those companies. That's a lot of companies. I think some people have taken a different approach and decided to vote against a substantially more.
Dana?
Hi, Aisha. Hi, Brian. I have several questions that probably won't surprise you. So I guess I will start with a couple comments you've already made, some topics that we've already hit, and then I'll get to the stuff that is new. So we were just talking about executive comp, and you were talking about for those that we vote against, we reach out to them or try to reach out to them afterwards and say, these are the reasons why we voted against your package or whatever. How much engagement do we do before saying, we think you have an egregious practice? If you don't think about changing it, if this is how it comes out in your proxy statement, we're gonna have to vote against it. Do we do the same type of engagements?
So we do, but I would say it's mostly when companies proactively reach out to CalSTRS. Part of our process is and over the past few years, the number of companies proactively reaching out for engagement has gone up tenfold, probably. And so part of that process is, we look at how did we vote at the company last year? Are there any other issues that we think we need to discuss with them, not just what's on their agenda? And obviously, if compensation's on that list, then from our team, we have certain people that are obviously involved in that discussion. But we look at what we think are important to us and not just what they want to talk about, but what we also want to talk about.
Right, absolutely. Alrighty, and we're kind of blending some of the things we're gonna talk about on the next one. So it's human capital management and within this plan, where would human capital management fit into it, specifically along the lines of sexual harassment and misconduct? And a lot of the things that we do within our corporate governance and our efforts are done in coalition with other entities. And what other entities are working on the sexual harassment misconduct that you know of already?
Well, I would say one, this Human Capital Management Coalition is a big part of that. And we've been involved with them, but like I said, I think that's one issue, but it's a holistic. It's hard to separate, trying to retain and engage employees and making sure that they have proper, controls in terms of any type of harassment. So all of those things we talk sort of comprehensively with companies about. That answers your question.
All right.
And I'm not sure that there are any, right now, at least coalitions or efforts
It's specific to
specifically
that.
about sexual harassment.
Hopefully there will be in the future. All right, the not so far future. All righty, so then a couple things that are kind of totally off topic already. So under our managing methane emissions, I know that we've been doing that for a while. We've been really successful in some. There's several repeats that we're having to reach out to. How many companies now have we reached out to and how successful have we been through the years that we've done it? Do you think?
I'd probably have to estimate, so over the years, I would say maybe 2,000 or 3,000 companies we've reached out to, and maybe 50% of those we've actually had some pretty decent engagements. Certainly, there are a few repeat offenders, but I'll say from a resource perspective and with focus more on the TCFD and SASB and the Climate Action 100 Plus, our efforts around methane haven't been as much as they have in past years. I mean, we do work collaboratively with Boston Common leads a really nice collaborative engagement that Apache, and so we tend to meet sort of more large groups of companies and large groups of investors and fewer resources directed on kind of one-on-one engagements.
Okay. And then my last question is on the auditor section. I just want to make sure I understood this because it seems really bizarre to me. That we're going to be engaging with approximately 40 to 50 companies that have an auditor tenure of 75 years or more? Seriously?
Seriously.
Wow.
No, it's not.
Wow. That's like generational.
Yes.
Wow. All right.
And part of it's a supply issue. I mean, there are 4 major
Oh, that's true, too.
auditing
Okay.
firms, and a lot of them specialize in certain areas. And there was a mandate a while back to rotate the principal, but some of these, I mean, it's 70. Yeah, that's not a misprint.
That was stunning.
Some of them are 100. We had a few that are 100.
That's stunning. All righty, thank you.
Nora?
So, sort of as a follow-up to the conversation that we had in San Diego, right, around the data collection and one of the things that happens as to why we don't have women on corporate boards, it's because there is no pipeline, which you've talked about. And the women who end up sitting on corporate boards have a certain background, where they come from, experience, so on and so forth. And so it seems to me that there's a direct correlation between pay equity, the pipeline, and a corporate board. And I feel like if we're working on this and we're not working on this and this, it's never gonna work. And so I know that you have to prioritize, but I'm trying to figure out there's all these different coalitions that are working on this. And there's some equity partners that are part of this as well, but many of these equity partners are not the equity partners that are working on issues of also pay equity and or building pipelines. And so I'm wondering if maybe part of what we need to do is really sort of step back and think about it from a more holistic perspective, right? So that we're not just focused on, we need more women on corporate boards, because the reality is that the likelihood of having diversity on the boards with that sort of theme, it's not really gonna happen. It's gonna take a long time before that change actually happens, and 30 years is too long, in my opinion, based on who we are, and look at the change of, the faces of Congress changed yesterday, and they changed because there was a very intentional move of how to do that work and how to make sure that we are identifying these women who are going to be able to do this. And so is there a way to work on the issue of pipeline, pay equity, pipeline, and the corporate representation together with the other institutional groups that are also doing this? Not only, I think it's important to, learn from what non-US institutional investors are doing, but I really think it should be a priority for the United States because of who we are and the power that we have. And so I don't know that I have an answer for you, but I do think that there maybe redirecting how we look at this issue, I think, is really critical. Because in my opinion, the way we've been looking at it is not really working. I mean, 50 women being on corporate boards that don't really represent who we are as a nation, I don't think is enough. And so how do we, as institutional investors, partner up with other, institutional investors to really change it from a different lens?
And you actually bring up a really good point, because I know we sort of isolate these issues in the report, but I hope the board appreciates that when we talk to companies, it's all of those things. It's very difficult to say, only talk about corporate board diversity if you're not talking about how they're engaging their own workforce. Or we can't talk about, compensation if you're not talking about pay equity within the organization. So we do have those conversations, but you're right, I don't know that there's one organization out there that's sort of, encompassing that all.
Yeah, I apologize for interrupting you, but maybe there is, as we're gathering this data, right, of people who are interested in serving corporate boards, and we're assessing whether or not there's pay equity in these corporations, maybe there's a way to identify, okay, sort of where are you, like a report card, where are you on pay equity, where are you on, and showing it in one format so that we can really, data is power, right? And that's the only way we can demonstrate that, the more diverse your workforce is, probably the difference of ideas, the power that you're gonna have, the return on your investment is greater, right? It's not just to have brown people or people of color on these posts just to have them, because it actually makes a difference when you have, you don't have one only way of thinking. And so it seems to me that there might be a different way of looking at it that nobody's thought about yet, that we may be challenging.
Well, and I think that goes back to what I was saying in the beginning about the Human Capital Management Coalition, because I think what they're trying to do is gather that data. What are the data points that are linked to value creation? So is it, less injuries on the workforce? Is it pay equity? Is it less turnover? Those are all the things that we're trying to figure out what links to value, and then what needs to be disclosed to investors. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's going to be a really powerful group, but it's hard. We can't focus on that without, also incorporating the board and the leaders and focusing on diversity there too. Yeah. So it's hard to separate any of these issues.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, seeing no one else in the queue, I just, a couple of thoughts. Climate, board diversity, the litany of, obviously, the gun engagement, which is, we funded that separately. We want a special report on that. We realize what that's about and will be updated, which was added by the committee. I think we should probably leave some space in there for issues that surface throughout the year. I think there's a trend that things get surfaced and we want to direct our staff to do more. So we should, anticipate that. As it relates to executive comp, speaking for myself, it's obviously an important issue. I'd like to have it came up last meeting as well, and perhaps we could have, maybe it's a closed session discussion about, how much time are you spending on engaging companies and how you actually make the selection of which companies. You gave us some broad strokes as to what you do, but how much time is that taking up with our staff? And do we want our resources, you guys, to spend more time on board diversity and climate and the other issues that are important to us? And we have a view around compensation. We want it linked, long-term, performance, et cetera. It's so nuanced. And 20% of 3,000 companies, that's a lot of companies. And then do you ever rotate through those companies? Do you say, okay, we've engaged with them, they haven't changed, they're not going to change, we don't see eye to eye with them on that, and it's time to move on? Because you're limited as well, right? Chris has made it very clear, we know your team is limited in terms of your size. These issues are going to continue to be important. You've made it very clear to us that you want us to focus, help guide and prioritize for you what's important to us. What I'm saying is executive comp, as the chair of the committee, people may disagree, is not as high on my list of priorities. It's important, but it's not as high on my list of priorities. And maybe we could have a more detailed conversation in closed session at a future meeting about how you ultimately decide which companies you're going to engage with and vote against the pay packages. So we have a couple other people in the queue here. We have a couple of people in the queue. Sharon.
So I just wanted to clarify, so the engagement plan that you're presenting to us, I mean, we're going to take action on today. And it's basically as best we can with the resources we have this year, and because it's timely in nature for proxy season, we need to direct you, basically your team, now, today, given what you've put in your report as it is. So I put, the things I got out of the report was executive comp, sustainability, risk management, which I would maybe put in, I think the language is always tricky, but I think we know what we mean by that. Opioids, human capital management / diversity, and then the virtual shareholder meetings. And I think my only thought, as you guys think about prioritizing time and resources, because I'm trying to do this in my own life, like, there's so many things we want to do, is just figuring out what, in my mind, as a fiduciary of the fund, it's what of these things move the needle the most, right? In terms of, at the end of the day, what helps us influence change that actually helps our bottom line. Ultimately, that's our job. We want to make more money for California teachers and their retirement. So what of these initiatives have the best bang for our buck? And so as you guys think about, and I do think, I think it would be good to have a conversation in the spring, maybe, to the list of 30 or so, I would like to see that list to combine from all of our different inputs, to see that list and have another conversation as a board to kind of maybe proactively direct you for next year's, season, for this conversation next year, in the spring. But I think for me, as you direct your time and energy, I would want us to be spending time on things that we really feel, and I know it's sort of mushy, right? It's a little subjective, but what initiatives will really move the needle for our bottom line, right? That will actually help us be, more successful in terms of our returns, and then kind of leverage the relationships we have to really move the needle. Whether that's executive compensation or I think areas like diversity and human capital management, I think. That's just my feeling is focus on the areas that we really can move the needle. Because I think the conversation we're having is a lot around, there's a lot of things we have values about, but at the end of the day, it's value, right? It's providing value for this fund. So I know sometimes we give you mixed messages, but I wanted to direct you clearly, that's how this board member feels, is to spend your time on things that really move the needle.
And I think that that's, my opening remarks. I mean, the engagement plan, obviously we want input from the board, but these are the issues that we think are material and fundamental to the portfolio. And they're also those issues where we feel we can be effective. Either that means we're leveraging our resources with other institutional players, or we've been able to move the needle, whether that be, I have lots of examples of, exec compensation plans that have been improved drastically by shareholder engagement, or diversity. I mean, the hundreds of women that we've gotten appointed to boards. I mean, there are places, and all the things that, Brian does on the Sustainability Fund, these are places where we can actually make a difference. And not to mention some of the market structure issues that come up, virtual meetings, dual class shares, things that we need to preserve our rights as shareholders so that we can be effective. So that's why all these items are in this plan. Obviously, it can be amended, but this is why we brought this to you today.
Paul and then Lynn.
Thank you. I kind of want to follow on from what Sharon said, because I think Sharon is exactly right, that it's such a long list. And in the next item, we've got 35 things on the list, and we're adding to the list. And it's not a matter of what we sort of like, it's not our values, as Sharon said, it's what has the greatest value. So I agree, we can see that we could take on an executive compensation and have an impact. We could see that we could take on board diversity and have an impact. But that has an impact on board diversity or on executive compensation. There's a next step, which is, does it improve the value of our portfolio? Where does the effort yield results for our portfolio? And that's what I'd love to see, next year, is a little bit more structure around, which of these efforts really do we think has benefit for the value of our portfolio? Because otherwise, it's very difficult, to pick and choose. They all sound good. Auditor rotation, climate change, I don't know,
I knew you'd bring up the auditor rotation.
Well, but the problem is there's no basis. I mean, you're asking us to approve this, and I'm kind of a little bit awash because I don't really have a grounding in knowing how to make that decision, and that's what,
Chris wants to jump. Chris, yeah.
Yeah, no, just to respond, and actually I'll tag Stephen and Alan to comment, because Alan knows the history. The board has asked us over the decades to try and do exactly what you're asking, Paul, and I asked that when I came to STRS, which is, hey, you spend a lot of money on corporate governance, does it move the needle? We have a budget of almost $3 million a year on our staff and our activities in corporate governance. Does it generate profit? Research papers can assign some value, but I can't disaggregate the return of a stock and show you, bingo, that proxy moved the needle. And that's the hardest thing. I agree. I guess what I would add to what Aisha said, this is our judgment of what moves the bottom line and is the most valuable for our time and effort. There might be something that really moves the bottom line, but we know we can't have any impact on it. I'll say like interacting with a company where a family owns 50%, try all we want, we're never gonna work it. But this is our best judgment. Alan, have you guys been able to quantify the value of corporate governance activity?
There's academic research on gender diversity. There's a lot of support there. There's mixed on the ESG, particularly the environmental and the social. It's much harder to quantify that. But the only one where there's a real body of evidence is good corporate governance, which includes diversity, adds value to the bottom line. But whether you can measure that in a quarter or a year or a decade, that becomes the challenge. So you have to believe the premise. And I think a fundamental part of their work is saying there's a series of premises that go into the thinking, i.e., climate change will eventually have a major impact on the balance sheet of a company. Well, there's a debate in the community about whether or not it's true. And the same thing could go for tobacco. It could go for a number of other areas where reasonable people could reach different conclusions. And then it comes down to the time period. And that is, we'll discuss this when we talk about some other issues, but things change. And people just didn't recognize that seatbelts were a good idea. I mean, they fought it. I mean, I remember I refused to use a seatbelt. And so the whole series of things that people just take for granted, that I think you're trying to be as an institution forward thinking and being in front of the curve, and this is designed to help you get there. But can you quantify it? A big challenge.
Yeah. And I'd just add, just back to executive compensation again. That's one, it's hard to say, okay, if you have aligned compensation, you're going to create value. But I do know if you're paying a CEO millions and millions of dollars that's coming out of the shareholders' basically bank account, and they're underperforming and not providing value, I know that's not a good alignment. So that's one where
Right, so I think, I mean, I appreciate, Alan, what you said, which is that the thing that has been demonstrated to have the most obvious impact is ensuring good governance. And so, I think executive compensation is one part of that. It doesn't mean we vote against every pay package, but saying that it is an important thing we look at is important. Auditor rotation becomes part of that too. I mean, I like just having, to that degree, having some direction about where the focus of corporate governance should be.
Lynn?
Oh, thank you. So I would agree, I appreciate your comments about executive comp, Harry, but I think that maybe a broader conversation in closed session about strategy would be helpful, because I do think that's kind of fundamental to the governance issue. And are we as shareholders getting what we should be getting, or is it going too much toward the executives? Thanks.
Karen?
Well, I'm confused. I just kind of want to back up a little bit, because on this item, we're supposed to do an action item. You talked about the issues that you want us to put in priority. You have a plan, a basic plan of the issues that you think are the ones that we want to deal with, right? And it's supposedly during fiscal year 18-19, which is what we're in now. So all of these things are a lot of work, okay? Everybody agrees on that. But today is November. The end of the fiscal year is June.
Karen, will you just push a button again there? Thanks. Okay.
So between now and then, do you have the resources in your staff to do all the things that this engagement plan is requesting? So I'm just wondering, just logistics and the people power that it will take to accomplish all of these tasks.
Giving too much homework.
I don't know,
For the things that are listed in this engagement plan, yes, we do. And some of them are, you've seen them before.
Right,
These are
right.
multi-year engagements. What Chris is referring to is there are a laundry list of other issues that have come our way, and we want to make sure that we're focusing on the right issues with direction from the board. So for this plan, yes. That's not to say it can't be amended.
Okay, so in addition to these, that you have wiggle room to amend, to add additional ones, should they occur?
But that's
if
where
they
we
come
want
up?
direction in terms of priority.
Right, okay, and that's what you would do. And so are these listed in terms of what the corporate governance committee is saying as their priority list? Or are they just put in here? In
There
any
is no
kind of
order
Okay.
to how they're listed in the engagement plan.
Okay. Thank you. Don't laugh.
Okay, anyone else? Questions? Comments? Is it any clearer to you?
Well,
So what
there-
I've heard,
is there a motion to approve the?
yeah, is
I
there-
was
is there
gonna say, I'll make a motion.
motion to approve,
Sorry,
and
Aisha,
properly
we forgot
second.
about that part.
Aisha sits on a board.
Yeah, exactly. All those in favor? Opposed? So they're there. Executive comp, diversity, climate. Before you add to the litany of the issues that are at guns, climate, executive comp, diversity, before you add to the list of litany of issues, be thoughtful about bringing more stuff to us, understand whether or not it's material to the improvement to the fund, perhaps a closed session discussion on executive comp and which companies you decide to engage with and why. That's what I heard.
Yes.
Yeah? Okay.
Can I make one last
Sure.
request?
Yeah.
I just know in talking to several board members that there's a lot of, I think we all have kind of our areas of interest in corporate governance. And so I know some of us are really excited about corporate diversity. And so I guess when I looked through the report and saw the different organizations that you guys are engaging with, I know for me, even as a new board member, it was really helpful. I went to an annual meeting in Los Angeles. And I guess I just wanted to invite board members to initiate with our corporate governance staff. If you want to go to an annual meeting to see how that goes. I know for me, I'd love to go to the 30% Club. I've mentioned that before. Anything on diversity on corporate boards. I know Nora's interested in that. Joy, so I guess I just wanted to make sure board members knew if you want to tag along or be invited to some of these conferences or something that you're engaged with, that there's an invitation for us to be involved and to not be, shy, because I think you guys like hanging out with us, right? Isn't it fun to have board members come to things? So it's actually very interesting because we talk about this stuff, but it's helpful as a board member to go, I think, and just see how our staff engage with the conversations. I think it helps give a lot more color to the engagements that you do, so.
Is it,
That's it.
Alan, do you need?
Just very
We're running a little,
Right, the comment was that the staff was gonna come up with more ideas. I would say history would indicate that it's the board that comes up with the new ideas. It tells the staff to do it. I just want to make the record clear on that.
yeah, correct. Yeah, so, all right, so
We don't laugh for that.
You're implying that we have a lot of ideas?
thanks, and continue the great work of collaborating across the globe and making a difference on all these important issues, because we are making a difference.
Yep.
People realize who we are and what we're trying to accomplish in the work that you're doing and carrying out. All right, item 12.
Item 12. You have the update in your board materials. I think you all know we periodically bring back the principles to the board when we see the need for updates. There are 3 items listed. The human capital management, this is something that I think, since we just discussed it, we're already talking to companies about this, but we wanted to be explicit about our expectations of boards, and that's related to culture and making sure they have, practices that protect employees. The second is on the virtual or hybrid meetings. I think you saw that. We've seen an increase in virtual-only meetings. We just want technology to be used to include shareholders and not as an exclusive mechanism. And the third item is just updating. It's just an administrative procedure because of the new ESG risk factors, because that's an attachment to our corporate governance principles. So I will entertain any questions.
Thank you very much. Dana?
So first of all, thank you for adding the language in human capital management, very much. I do have a question on the virtual and hybrid shareholder meetings, and I have a suggestion.
Okay.
I think that we feel strongly that anybody that wants to attend a meeting in person should have the choice to do so. So I'm thinking that last sentence should actually be the lead-in to the paragraph.
Okay.
And take out the virtual-only meeting. I mean, it just reads weird. Any person wanting to attend a virtual-only meeting in person, it's kind of an oxymoron, it's virtual only or whatever. But if we start that whole paragraph with, anybody that wants to attend in person should have the right to do so. I think that that clarifies our feelings about it. And then we get into that the hybrid is a best practice and that technology should only be used as a supplement and not as a substitute.
That makes sense.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dana. Frank?
Hi, excuse me. The Glass Lewis proxy guidelines they have a section on virtual shareholder meetings also. In it, they have a requirement that virtual meetings be explained in the proxy statements. The rights and responsibilities of shareholders, whether it be virtual or in person, be explained in the proxy statements. Is that something that you think you might want to include in this too, rights and requirements for shareholders?
Well, I think for the most part, companies do a fairly good job of explaining that in the proxies.
But as they pertain to virtual meetings in particular?
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at the specifics. I think most companies are adhering to what's called the Broadridge issued a best practices document in terms of conducting a virtual only meeting. And that's what we're talking to a lot of companies about. The one piece that they're missing, and there's a lot of disclosure aspects as part of adhering to the Broadridge best practices, is this piece, if you really want to attend in person, you should be able to do so. And so we wanted to make that explicit in our principles.
Okay, thank you.
Seeing no one else, there's a recommendation on INV 88.
Sorry, Karen and I are a little too slow. I
Okay,
guess.
Sharon?
Mr. I just wanted to clarify, since I've been on the board, we've always talked about the 21 risk factors. So moving forward is the language we're all using is the ESG risk factors, correct?
That's
Is
the
that-
title of the.
Okay, I just wanted to.
We amended it.
Right, I remember some amending, and I'm totally fine with it. I guess, maybe I'm channeling you today, Dana, but I do feel like when we go around the country and people talk about that, I just think it's helpful, when we change the language now for everybody on the same page. So we're talking ESG risk factors moving forward when we engage with our relationships with folks, and in our written documents, it's communicated that way,
Yes.
correct? Awesome, great, that's it. Thanks.
Karen?
Thanks. Aisha, I think I asked you this question already offline, but I was looking to the policy and I was trying to find it in the policy manual and I couldn't find it, and then explain where this is in the realm of paper or.
Exactly. So several years ago, this was actually shortly after I arrived at CalSTRS, we took the corporate governance principles out of the Teachers Retirement Board manual because it was sort of buried, and we put it on our website because there's a lot of external parties that are interested in our principles, companies that we're invested with, other investors, and so we wanted to make it very visible on our website. Plus, in some cases, we even hand it out to folks that are interested in. That being said, unfortunately, in the agenda item, there was it was sending you to the wrong place on the website, but it is there. It's under corporate governance. Our principles, along with all our proxy votes, are there on the website.
Manual?
It is not in the board
Right,
manual.
right,
It
okay.
only references that it's on the CalSTRS website.
Okay.
Yes.
You good, Karen? Okay, Dana?
So Aisha, going back to the human capital management, we've included it in the principles, but we really don't have it in our risk factors. And so I guess I would ask you to consider possibly where that would fit in. And I guess I'm looking under workers' rights, and I think it's a worker's right to work in a place that's free of harassment, and particularly sexual harassment and misconduct. So the only thing we say within workers' rights is acceptable work conditions. And so, is that going to be sufficient? Do we need to include it in our ESG? That's not something I think we need to vote on now, but I just ask you to think about it. Because then not only do we have it in our principles, but we also have it in our ESG risk factors. And I don't know if this comment is more appropriate for this conversation or for a conversation we're going to have later, but a lot of our risk factors have to do with other countries, and I guess I look at, what's the banking, there's a whole list of principles.
Sanctioned like sanctioned countries or?
Equator principles, thank you. So the Equator principles, when things were happening,
Yes.
and I think it was around the North Dakota pipeline.
Yep.
Thank you. That was Philip,
Yes,
wasn't
that
it?
was Phil.
Philip, you're channeling me. Thank you. So the Equator principles, we realized when we were having the conversation about the North Dakota pipeline, is there that often, I shouldn't say often, but sometimes those Equator principles were stronger for other countries than ourselves. And I found when we had a discussion in the other item that sometimes these ESG factors are focused on other countries. And I think we put a lot of them together when we started doing emerging markets. And so maybe we can take, in your spare time, take a look at how do we tighten up the language on these to include what's happening in the United States as well as other markets that we're involved in. Thank you.
Dana, the only other thing I would point out, because there is a respect for human rights and then a discrimination based on, I don't know if that.
Yeah, I looked at
completely
those
covers
two and it
that.
just really didn't kind of go
Yeah.
in the workplace. So we just need to take a look at, if we can, and see if that's appropriate.
Yes.
And if it's appropriate to include it, where best to include it. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle?
Just if there were no other comments, I was going to move approval of the item with Dana's suggestions earlier.
Okay, been moved and properly second with the changes recommended by Dana. Seeing,
Yes.
The earlier, yeah.
Yeah, the earlier one
on
the principal. Never mind.
okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, motion passes. Thank you. Thank you. Item 13. Philip, welcome. Good afternoon, Philip.
Thank you again, Philip.
I know. Equator principles.
That's a good Marine.
These are
That's a
good
good,
stuff.
that's a Marine.
What's the thing for, mine's not Semper,
Semper Fi.
Semper Fi?
Yes. Phil knows what that
Semper
means.
Fi.
I've heard it.
Philip, Chris, you kicking it off? Go ahead, Chris. Go ahead.
So we have a very lengthy item. I just want to state for the record, so you're aware, I personally understand and actually share the anger and the pain that has been caused by this current administration's immigration policy. As fiduciaries to CalSTRS, though, you have to make a decision as best you can without any emotion. And I know on this issue, it's tough. We learned through our engagement and our education, and we tried to present that in the packet. The U.S. immigration laws were mostly drafted and approved way back in the Clinton administration, and they have not changed much, unfortunately. What has changed over the decades has been how different administrations interpreted the immigration laws. Obviously, the current administration's decision to separate families, I share that outrage with millions and millions of Americans and our members. And the anger that policy was really directed by our membership at two specific companies that are for-profit entities in the detention and incarceration business. We did our face-to-face due diligence. We met with these companies' executives personally. I employed senior staff, myself, Scott, the corporate governance team, the stakeholder engagement team participated. So we didn't, we made a major effort to meet with these people and understand them. And one of the clear takeaways for us was that the anger at this policy, these companies did not detain unaccompanied children. They only detained families, but what's quite clear is that it was the U.S. Health and Human Services Department, which when a child is detained and is unaccompanied, the Immigration and Enforcement Service hands them over to HHS. And I think that's where a lot of the anger and the frustration lies. We tried to meet with representatives of HHS, ICE, and even the federal government, and we're unable to. But many of the questions that regard this investment, Scott and Philip and a team visited a site in Texas where they detain families. They looked into the educational services, the living conditions, the food, the work conditions, and spent a good number of hours touring that entire facility. I visited a facility here in California that detains immigrants and has been the subject of an internal investigation by the IAG and has been in the LA Times. And we personally met with the executives. We personally toured the facilities to understand many of the questions that our membership raised in some of the letters we got. And I can answer those questions if you want us to get into details. The one thing I would keep in mind is as we met with these people, the employees of this company, the vast majority of them are actually in a union. And in particular, the case of California, a couple of the employees I met, their spouses are actually members. In one case of an executive, their spouse is a 16-year member of our system. So these were real people and real lives on both sides. The question of our divestment policy is whether these companies violated our 6 particular risk factors that we looked at, and if there was a substantial loss of revenue from their activities or a potential loss of trust of our members. We engaged the companies directly. As I mentioned, we visited them. We talked to the companies about whether they could change the use of their facilities because they're structured as REITs, and their answer was they're not willing to. We talked about the contractors that provide this, who they consider are their clients, like the government and the cities and counties. They can change the use of the facility if they need to change for a customer, but they explained how that's a very, very slow process because customers, the cities, counties, the federal government don't build facilities very quickly. We did talk about the risk of a loss of revenue to them. And when Philip and I and the team really sat down and deliberated at length about this, we really tried to use our judgment about whether these companies are violating our 21 risk factors or whether, in our opinion, we think more likely it is the contractors that are actually violating some of our 21 risk factors, the entities that are using these facilities and setting up these rules and laws. So for us, it was very difficult to make a determination that there was a substantial loss of revenue. The challenge, I think, for you is that we want to invest in countries that have a rule of law. We understand that those countries' rule of law then comes with the likelihood of detention and incarceration. But the difference is when that is actually being done, instead of by a government, by a for-profit entity. And I have to say, from my personal perspective, I think it's a very honest and open question, and many of our members have stated it, is the business, a for-profit business of incarceration and detention, immoral. But the challenge I have to give you is that morality is not in one of our risk factors, our ESG risk factors. It really is more in the eye of the beholder, and that's one of the challenges I think you have to decide is how this is a risk in our portfolio. And is it acceptable for us to own a company that makes a profit from providing that kind of a service? In our memo, we went in great length to go through how the risks and the factors on these companies. We shared with you that they represent a very small portion of our portfolio, only about $10 million out of the $57 billion U.S. equity portfolio, and about $2 million out of the $27 billion fixed income portfolio. I believe you have all the information in front of you that you need to make your decision. Obviously, that's up to legal counsel to always decide that. And I think part of the big challenge to you is to decide that if owning these companies harms the trust of a majority of our members, and I can tell you staff, we can't decide that. That really is up to you as to the trustees of the plan and knowing the membership. But I'm prepared to respond to any of the questions you have. Philip is up here because he drafted most of the memo and attended all the facilities and meetings. But I also recommend you turn it over to the consultants and hear from them on these issues, because it's important to get them on the record.
Thank you, Chris. Philip, extraordinary report. Very thorough. A+. Balanced. 17 attachments.
Just like we like.
It is a extraordinary body of work on a very complicated topic. And I know that, but you led it, I understand. So, thank you, sir. Alan and Stephen, a couple of questions before, and then you can comment, and then we'll turn it over to the committee for, we'll take public comments, and then we'll turn it to the committee. A couple of questions I had. One is around, should the committee make a decision to exclude these companies? Do you have a view on whether or not that decision would materially impact the trust fund's ability to generate a 7% assumed rate of return over the next 30 years?